Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Stein, North Carolina's Attorney General, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Resilience, as you all have just seen, is a powerful film. I was fortunate to watch it for the first time a few years ago and was incredibly affected by it. The film demonstrates how our childhood experiences impact who we become as adults, how we navigate this world around us, and how we build relationships with others. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, have a direct correlation to each person's personal health and welfare, which can in turn affect each community's safety and stability. ACEs and the justice system are inextricably linked. Having a parent who is incarcerated is an adverse childhood experience, and no matter how they become involved, a child who has interactions with the criminal justice system can suffer negative impacts well into their adulthood. On top of that, there are racial disparities in the involvement of children in the justice system, just as it's so with adults. Young people of color are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. As of 2020, kids of color made up 46% of the population here in North Carolina, age 6 to 17. But they make up 71% of complaints received and 80% of commitments to youth development centers. These disparities are deeply problematic. If these children make their way into the system, frankly, we're failing them. We should be making sure that as many kids as possible have support services, mental health services, guidance counselors, community programs, all that they need to help them navigate the challenges that they are facing, for which they have no responsibility. And when possible, they can then avoid ever becoming involved with the criminal justice system. As adults, we have a responsibility to support young people and give them their best chances of success in life. That requires that we have a responsibility to recognize and effectively respond to childhood trauma. Doing so will give them the best opportunity to heal and achieve the life that they dream of. It is an education issue, a justice system issue, a social services issue, a healthcare issue, a public safety issue. Many people, adults and children, that we see committing violent crime have been subject to childhood trauma themselves. It's the old saying that hurt people hurt people. When we prevent and respond to ACEs, we can advance public safety because we can reduce crime. That is our shared responsibility. As North Carolina's Attorney General and as co-chair of the North Carolina Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice, these are issues incredibly relevant to the work we do. We at the Department of Justice are committed to being part of the solution and expanding the use of trauma-informed practices in schools, our courts, and communities. We've been inspired by what we've been seeing across North Carolina, where folks are doing great things and seeing incredibly encouraging results. And we've been inspired by our colleagues in the judicial branch. I want to thank the Chief Justice for creating his task force on ACEs-informed courts, and I'm so pleased that we can partner on this event together today. In a few minutes, we'll be discussing our thoughts on this movie and hearing from leaders across North Carolina who are doing this work, the important work, to create healthy communities and help people overcome the effects of trauma that they experienced. And I look forward to that conversation. Thank you very much.
Mike, we'd love to hear a few words from you.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Chief Justice, Paul Newby, Judge Andrew Heath, Director of the Administrative Office of the Courts, and the Chief Justice's Task Force on ACEs-informed courts, I'd like to say welcome and thank you to everyone for logging on today. In May of 2021, the Chief Justice, along with the ACEs Task Force co-chairs, Judge Andrew Heath and Ben David, elected District Attorney in New Hanover and Pender counties, announced the creation of the Chief Justice's Task Force on ACEs-informed courts. The mission of that task force is to enable judicial branch stakeholders to understand the impact on children of exposure to ACEs and to develop strategies for addressing adverse consequences within our court system. The task force is comprised of judicial branch stakeholders, including district attorneys, public defenders, clerks, as well as subject matter experts from the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Juvenile Justice, the Bosch Institute at Duke Law School, the UNC School of Government, as well as foundation support from the Weiner Family Foundation and Foundation for the Carolinas. I'd quickly like to highlight two of our accomplishments that the task force has done since we began our work last year. First, in meeting with our mission to enable judicial branch stakeholders to understand the impact on children of exposure to ACEs, we have published a North Carolina trauma-informed bench card. You can find that bench card at nccourts.gov/ACEs. And I'll try to get that into the discussion panel shortly. In partnership with the Bosch Institute, this bench card reflects a strong collaboration between experts in trauma-informed practices, the judicial branch stakeholders, and AOC. This bench card is different than national models as it reflects what our constituency groups wanted to know and is focused on information our practitioners wanted to know in a format they felt was best for them to better be trauma-informed. Secondly, in meeting our mission to develop strategies for addressing adverse consequences within our court system, and in partnership with the UNC School of Government, we have created two new advanced certifications for district court judges, one in child welfare and a second in juvenile justice. Our hope is that these two new advanced certifications will better equip and provide district court judges with the educational trainings they need to be both better trauma-informed within the judicial system and to make sound decisions so that justice can be administered without favor, denial, or delay. I'm very excited to hear everyone on this panel speak. Thank you all for your time. And this is very exciting and a wonderful partnership between AOC and Department of Justice.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thank you, Attorney General Stein. My name is Jasmine McGee, and I'm Director of Public Protection for the North Carolina Attorney General's Office and also one of the staff leads for the Governor's Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice. Before we get started, I want to give you one housekeeping note related to the film Resilience. If you didn't get the link to watch the film and registered for this event, please check your spam for an email from criminaljustice@ncdoj.gov. I will put that link in the chat. And if you didn't register for this event, you can still get access to the film if you email us at that same email through by the end of the day tomorrow. We have access to the film through tomorrow. That also goes for those of you that may be watching this later on YouTube. So email us if you want to get a chance to see it. We want as many people as possible to do so. So we are fortunate today to have a great panel of individuals who deal directly with confronting the impacts of adverse childhood experiences. Because I want you to hear directly from them, I'm just going to introduce them by name and title. And when they first start talking, they will explain their connection and background to this topic when they begin. And so today we have with us task force. We have two task forces here today. So TREC, the Governor's Task Force member and Executive Director of IDS, Mary Pollard, Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Chief Johnny Jennings, Durham District Court Judge Amanda Maris, New Hanover and Pender County District Attorney Ben David. And I think we just lost one of our panelists, but hopefully she'll get back to us before we begin the panel, juvenile defender Terry Johnson. And but before we jump into the panel, I want to invite District Attorney Ben David to give us a little bit more background on ACEs. DA David.
Thank you, Jasmine, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my great honor to be asked to co-chair this incredible task force under the visionary leadership of our Chief Justice Paul Newby. His AOC director, the man standing behind his right shoulder in this picture, is Andrew Heath, who happens to be the co-chair of this ACEs-informed courts task force. Our task force has 20 stakeholders throughout the justice system, and we are diverse in every respect, demographically, geographically, and politically. And what brings us all together is the shared interest in making our state healthier and safer for our children, and to bring our courts into becoming more trauma-informed and resilient. You can follow our work by this website that is on the bottom, and I know that many links are being shared right now to get to the bench card and other resources we've developed. Next slide, please. I want to say that one thing I was able to live out a dream to do earlier this year was head out to San Diego, California to speak to the nation's prosecutors at the National District Attorneys Association, specifically about the film Resilience and the work with our Chief Justice's Task Force on ACEs Informed Courts. I reached out to Dr. Vincent Folletti, who is the founder of the ACEs study, who lives in San Diego. To my surprise, he not only showed up to the conference, but he took copious notes during it, and he actually joined me on the stage to answer questions. At the end, he said, "Ben, there are now 26 states in America who have put some form of ACEs study into legislation, but I have never seen a court system do that. It's always been through some public health initiative. But you've made the case to me, and I've never heard my work expressed in this way, that the root causes of crime are the same thing as the social determinants of health. And we can use the great science that prosecutors in particular have always relied upon in solving cases and proving them beyond a reasonable doubt to actually prevent cases from ever occurring. And that is an exciting thing that we use this biology of stress and science of hope to do. So please continue that work and tell as many people about it as you can. So with that, I'm going to share with you a few slides that I shared with Dr. Vincent Folletti and the nation's prosecutors earlier this year. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we have to confront as a state and a country is you are looking right now at the true epidemic. It's child abuse. 22% of our children here in this state, that's more than 1 in 5, will be investigated as victims of abuse, neglect, or dependency. And that number holds pretty steady wherever you go in this great country of ours. Here's the million-dollar question. What are we doing for this child right now? Because it's hard to say why she is covering her ears. Maybe she is listening to domestic violence. Maybe she's closing her eyes to not have to witness more of the drug use going on under the roof of her home. Maybe that shadowy figure is coming into her room late at night to sexually assault her. You know, with that last example, if she's an incest survivor, it's not uncommon for her to be in a caseload of ours. We're going to put him in prison for 30 years, and at $100 a day of incarceration, that's going to be over $1 million. What are we doing for her? Are we handling her complex post-traumatic stress? And by the way, let's not use post-traumatic stress disorder, because there's nothing abnormal about all the things she will experience over a lifetime dealing with that toxic stress, which is not an acute event, it's everyday trauma, day in and day out. And if we've learned nothing through the years, it is this: today's victim is tomorrow's defendant. Let's take a closer look at what we're talking about. Next slide, please. And these pictures are going to come in on clicks. I first met Amber in 1999. I began my career as a prosecutor the day after the Columbine tragedy, April 21st of 1999. And it didn't take me long to be introduced to this young woman. If you'll click the first picture, you'll see her. This is not a yearbook photo, it's a mugshot. Now here she is 2 years later. This is the same young woman, obviously looking a lot different. This is what crack cocaine looks like. Drug dealers forgot to tell her that. Now here she is 10 years after that, and now she's migrated to heroin. And it's no longer shoplifting, it's prostitution. And she has 3 children by 3 different men. Next slide. So it should be no surprise that here she is 20 years later, still serving out a life sentence 2 weeks at a time in our court system, not having committed violent offenses, but nonetheless going in and out of our system. We've had a robust drug treatment program here in the courts for the last 20 years in New Hanover County, and she's been in and out of those courts. And yet it hasn't seemed to help her that much, because what we've learned is that for her, she doesn't look at these drugs as a problem, but as a solution. She's medicating the childhood trauma she is seeing. Click. So what are we really understanding about this? The true gateway drug to heroin and fentanyl, it's not marijuana. And it's not even pills, although 80% of heroin users start with pills and 75% of them start with someone else's pills. No, the true gateway drug to all the drug we're seeing in the opioid epidemic is childhood trauma. So what does that lead us to? Well, next slide. What you can see is that we have now lost about a jetliner worth of people every day in this country. About 300 die each day. That's 8 North Carolinians, 2 a week in my district. This is an unmitigated and preventable tragedy. And if we can predict it, we can prevent it. We can absolutely stop this opioid epidemic by giving more resources to that little girl huddled into the corner, and not just when she grows up to be in our drug treatment courts. Now I'm going to pivot on you a little bit. Next slide. I'd like to introduce you to my first client. I never got to meet little Papa, Demetrius Green, but I certainly have come to know his family very well. Demetrius was killed in a war not of his own making. He was shot by a stray bullet by people who were not reporting their victimization, but picking up a gun and instead becoming vigilantes on the street. And when that stray bullet took the life of this young child, I was called upon to speak for him, to speak for the dead in a murder trial. Now, little Papa lived in a dangerous place called poverty, and he never committed any crime. And when I did a deeper dive as district attorney into disproportionate minority contact with the criminal justice system, here's what I found. Even though we have roughly 17% of our overall population in my district as people of color, it turns out that 82% of the murder victims are people of color, and almost all living below the poverty line. What I've come to understand is that high crime areas are also high victim areas. So what do we do about that? Well, next slide. The first thing we wanted to do is learn a little bit more about the community where some of our kids were growing up. These are kids who are not only being traumatized under the roof of their own home, but whole neighborhoods are being traumatized. We didn't pick these areas, the statistics picked them for us. We looked at police reports for open air drug transactions, carjackings, murders, armed robberies. We looked at hospital reports, and we even looked at ShotSpotter data that could quite literally triangulate where guns were going off in the city of Wilmington. We then drew a big zone around where we saw the most need for help. Next slide, Jasmine. And what we found was that a lot of the children were in a really dire situation. They were living in some very tough situations that we could help prevent. We patterned our efforts after the Harlem Children's Zone, and we called it the Youth Enrichment Zone. And we started dumping resources in from what I call the 5 arms of the starfish to really make a difference. But we wanted to learn not just where they were going to school, but their home environments. And so here's what we found. Next slide. We found that a lot of the youth violence we were seeing, these kids were hungering for structure and even joining gangs because they didn't have a lot of it at home. In fact, what we saw when we sent a social worker under the roofs of the children is that in 84 homes, next click, Jasmine, there were 256 children being raised in their homes and a total of just 4 fathers. When we talk about, the adverse community environments and not just adverse childhood experiences, we're talking about our youth enrichment zone. So where does that lead us? Next slide. It means that today's victim is tomorrow's defendant with the opioid epidemic. These young kids who are living in adverse childhood experiences can grow up to abuse drugs because they're looking at them as the solution. Or those kids who are not cooperating with the police after they've been shot, but turning to violence themselves. They might be a victim one day and 2 weeks later, now they're being charged with murder. This never-ending cycle of abuse, of poverty, of drug addiction, we stop it, we cut it in half by focusing on resilience. So what have we done in order to really make a difference in North Carolina? Well, first of all, next slide, we looked at what we've historically been saying, which is lock them up and throw away the key. Now that absolutely works for violent and career criminals, and we should be unapologetic about doing that in the worst kinds of cases. But no one thinks that we should be incarcerating drug addiction and mental illness, and particularly our children. So about a decade ago, we actually did something about that. We passed justice reinvestment, and we rewrote a lot of the sentencing charts, and we raised the juvenile age recently. We've done some wonderful things. In just this last 8 years, even as our population has continued to grow, we've reduced the prison population by 10%. We've closed 11 prisons. We've actually had 4,000 fewer beds now than just 10 years ago. Mass incarceration is a scourge that no one agrees with. We need to absolutely tell the story that if we're saving $500 million in the cost of incarceration by working smarter together in the justice system, that money needs to be reinvested into our communities to make our children more resilient. So if this pound of cure is not the answer for so many of the things that we're seeing, particularly children's crimes and opioid abuse, then what is the answer? Next slide. Well, it turns out that it's looking at the social determinants of health and understanding that we can take a different kind of patient history. Now, this movie Resilience really showed that to us. Next slide. It asked these 10 questions, and these 10 questions really strike at the core of what that little girl's experiencing under the roof of her own home and what those kids in our youth enrichment zone are experiencing also. You can actually break these 10 questions up into 3 categories, and you know what it means now, that for every answer yes, you can get a score of 0 or up to 10, and they have profound implications for the trajectory of that child's life. Next slide. Those 3 categories are abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, and Ken Folletti not only created that with Dr. Anda from the CDC in Atlanta, but they actually studied 27,000 patients. And then they expanded that study to 400,000 more. And so we have all this data now over the last 30 plus years that leaves us no doubt with the road ahead for these kids. I like this next slide even more because I think it really helps conceptualize what we're talking about in that movie Resilience and why we are absolutely excited on the Chief Justice's ACEs task force to get to work with all of you on this call. If you look at the tree, that's adverse childhood experiences. That's the opioid epidemic. That's the little girl in the corner. That's Amber. And if you look at the roots, that's adverse community environments. That's little Papa. That's the kids who are surrounded by gang violence and open air drug transactions. Our intercept point between these 2 great groups that are working on these issues is where we literally hit the ground. And we believe that there's many opportunities to focus on fighting this opioid epidemic, making our kids safer from gang violence and youth violence, and bringing about racial justice by really focusing on the social determinants of health and understanding that they're the same as the root causes of crime. Next slide. Because what we know is that the higher the ACE score, the higher of everything else we don't want to see in our community. For instance, here in the Port City, 62% of our IV drug users have an ACE score of 6 or higher. 70% of the people we see in, you have a 70% greater chance of being a victim or defendant in a violent crime case if your ACE score is 4 or higher. And for those who score 6 or higher on that same ACE score, we know that they have a 20-year less life expectancy than everyone else. Now, the true epidemic is child abuse. And the million-dollar question is, if we're giving all these resources to defendants, are we doing the same thing for victims? Because they have constitutional rights as well. Next slide. In fact, a great book that I would love for everybody to read if they haven't yet is The Body Keeps the Score. This is a profound statement, and it's absolutely the case. Eradicating child abuse in America would reduce the overall rate of depression by more than half, alcoholism by 2/3, and suicide, IV drug use, and domestic violence by 3/4. And it, of course, would also greatly decrease the need for our incarceration. So that means all of us need to get to work on understanding a little bit more about what that movie Resilience was really talking about. So how do we make our communities more resilient? Because if building prisons is not the answer, maybe it's building community. Next slide. I won't take too long on this right now, but only to say that we have 5 arms of outreach that we're really focusing on to make our communities and kids more resilient. We know that it involves working on all 3 branches of government. And we've talked about justice reinvestment and the great work that the Attorney General is doing and our Chief Justice is. The faith community really plays a role. For instance, in my district, when the jail closed 18 years ago to move out to the suburbs, leaving a hollowed out shell, we had the faith-based communities come in to make that place of incarceration a place of transformation. It's called the Harrelson Center. And where there are silos, there's now synergy between 22 nonprofit groups working on everything from human trafficking efforts to domestic violence to our drug treatment court, Habitat for Humanity, job creation programs. It's all immediately across the street from the courthouse, and it wouldn't exist if people didn't put their faith into work. As for our schools, I'm very proud of our Chief Judge Jay Corpening and the School Justice Partnership that we have now not just in this county, but in 40 others, where we've reduced juvenile petitions by 50% by saying to principals, keep that in your office and don't create a juvenile petition every time you can. There's some wonderful work going on with our school resource officers and justice officials around that. And when 2 out of 3 people in jail and prison are high school dropouts, keeping kids in school and keeping them resilient is everything. We can break the school to prison pipeline by doing that. And then for the business community, our leaders got to work here locally and said, the street shouldn't be the only equal opportunity employer. The people raising the kids, particularly in deepest poverty, need jobs. And they need to get those records expunged. It was our office who did that, to expand the Second Chances Act, to get people back to work. Prosecutors need to be focusing on that, and every justice official should too. Second chances and mercy has to be a part of making our communities more resilient. And finally, these nonprofits have really come together for collective impact. I would commend Cape Fear Collective to you, and specifically the dashboard that they are tying to the 2030 goals that the governor has to look at the social determinants of health by zip code. That's available for every nonprofit in this state now, and they've just recently launched it if you go to capefearcollective.org. We are doing wonderful things to make our communities more resilient by building community. Next slide. I'll say that Michael Silver mentioned this already, but this bench card that was just released to all judges and prosecutors last week is the direct work of the Chief Justice's ACES task force. We're very proud of it. Please spread it to all stakeholders inside and outside the courthouse. We believe that it's really going to help us all become more trauma informed, which was our goal for the first year of this task force. Specifically, we used the line that came from the Resilience movie, next slide, that we shouldn't be asking what's wrong with you, but rather what happened to you. When we put it through that different lens, we understand that this young woman you see on the left is not a prostitute. She's being prostituted. This young man is not a drug addict. He's a young man struggling with addiction. The children we see in our juvenile loads, they're not problem kids. They're kids with problems. When we change the noun to a verb, we start shifting the blame to where it needs to be, on the pimps and johns, on the drug dealers, not the users, and on the adverse childhood experiences and environments that these kids are enduring. By doing that, by labeling conduct rather than people, we come a lot closer to our ultimate goal of not blaming victims and making it equal under the law for everybody, defendants and victims. Finally, I'll say, next slide, that what we are ultimately after for year 2 of this task force is to do 3 things. First, as you can see on the left, we're about making our court system more resilient. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the 0 to 5 population that obviously doesn't have criminal charges yet, or they're not even parties to actions, but they might be in child support enforcement or termination of parental rights cases and custody mediation. We need to do everything we can to give those kids a secure and safe environment now while they're babies. There's no question that if we can cut down in half the time of particularly it takes for some of these placements, we're going to not re-victimize these children or traumatize them and get them the resources they need now. We also need to continue to focus on wonderful initiatives like that school justice partnership I mentioned, teen courts, and other things that are dealing directly with our children now. So the first thing is we need to focus on the court system and how we're intaking children while they're children. Second, we need to focus on when these kids grow up to be adults. Think of Amber. We need to expand therapeutic justice, specifically veterans treatment courts, drug treatment courts, mental health courts. We need to do everything we can to involve people in their treatment, asking what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. We're still not going to go light on violent crime. That's not the goal of this at all. In fact, we need to keep prison that scarce resource for those cases. But for so many people in the grips of addiction or in mental illness, and particularly for our kids, we must focus on rehabilitation through the therapeutic justice. And for those adults, that's the goal of being more resilient. And finally, for resource mapping, the third goal that we're really going to look at, we're going to continue to utilize great technology, like I mentioned earlier, through Cape Fear Collective. But I believe that our Chief Justice has shown remarkable leadership in turning to the Chief District Court judges in the 42 judicial districts and say, let's start doing resource mapping. Let's get a lay of the land for where we are right now in the year 2022. We know that there's a divide between the metro and rural areas as it comes to some resources, and the people who are locally rooted there are in the best position to know what gaps might be there and what redundancies might exist. We need to figure out what we can do to navigate these children towards the most resilient communities possible, because the overarching message of that movie Resilience is that a high score is not a death sentence. It's an opportunity to get these kids to the resources they need now to change the trajectory of their lives. We can do that in North Carolina. We are saving the courts and the state a whole lot of money through alternatives to incarceration, and we need to reinvest that into our children and into the communities. I'm so pleased to live in 2 great counties as district attorney that have resilience task forces that are very robust and have been doing this work. The great news for all of us in the justice system is that this movie Resilience is not a secret. A lot of people have been working very hard and want to partner with us, and we can't wait to get to work with them. Jasmine, thank you for letting me introduce the work of our Chief Justice's task force.
Thank you so much, DA David. I want to jump right in, but let the audience know that if you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A feature and not the chat. I see the chat's very active, and I'm glad y'all are excited. But if you have a question, to make sure we see them, put them in the Q&A. My first question is to the entire panel. What is the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the work that you do? And given that we just heard from our resident prosecutor, I'm going to go to you, Mary, first to answer that question.
Hey, well, it's first of all, I found the movie incredibly powerful, and I learned some things from it, particularly about the, I think I had always known that adverse childhood events would affect you emotionally and in terms of mental health disorders and substance abuse disorders, but I did not realize the extent that it would destroy you physically, and that was fascinating. How does it affect the work we do as defenders in criminal cases? The overwhelming majority of clients I have ever worked with would have scored exceedingly high on that ACEs questionnaire, 7, 8, 9, 10, many 10s. And it's critical. I applaud the Chief Justice for putting this task force together. It's critical that we recognize this, that we educate all the stakeholders in the system about the effects of childhood trauma, and that we move forward and make decisions about how to charge cases and assess punishments and rehabilitate folks who were convicted with that knowledge. And it sounds like that's the direction that we're going in based on the work of the task force. So thank you.
Chief Jennings.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It certainly is an honor to be a member of the task force and to be able to talk through this and how we can better serve our community. But I'm going to start out. Ben David mentioned something in his presentation that was extremely kind of sums up what it is for me in law enforcement. I've been doing this for 30 years now. And when I joined the department years ago, the answer was, Ben, you mentioned about locking them up and throwing away the key has been the answer in the past. And that's basically how it was. We had no alternatives to look at. We felt like the quickest way to solve an issue was to take someone to jail and lock them up and forget about it and let the court systems handle it from there. And then it would become a cycle where we were dealing with the same people over and over again. And I think that's what this task force is doing as far as on the law enforcement perspective is how do we get out of that and not put people in that cycle to begin with and to understand a little bit better about what brought them there in the first place. So as we look at what's changing, 30 years ago, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, we had no community engagement bureau or wasn't even considered that we would have an entire team of people to look at how do we engage with the community and how do we have better outcomes with the people that we come in contact with. So this is certainly a better piece of the puzzle that's been missing for years. It's something that's exciting in the law enforcement profession, not just a matter of we're going to respond and we're going to take people to jail, but how do we have better outcomes with those people we come in contact with?
Judge Maris?
Thank you, Jasmine. It's great to see everyone virtually today. Briefly, just wanted to tell you who I am. I am a district court judge here in Durham. I came on the bench in 2017, appointed by Governor Cooper. Previous to that, I spent 11 years as an assistant public defender in Durham in adult and juvenile court. In my first year on the bench, helped found the DEAR program, which is the Durham Expunction and Restoration Program, wherein we provide free legal services for expunctions, certificates of relief, and driver's license restoration. This program was used as a model for the rest of the state that has spread these services throughout, and very happy to see Durham continue to lead in system change. To answer the question, which is how have adverse childhood experiences impacted my work? I think we need to start with the premise, how has it not impacted our work? We need to start with the premise that we have over 60% of our youth here in the United States that have experienced abuse, neglect, or traumatic event before the age of 17. We all watched the movie. I've watched it some time ago, rewatched this morning when I had a lull in my docket. Shouldn't have done that because it always makes me cry. I don't know how it impacts the rest of you, but there's several moments where I'm just heartbroken at all the trauma that we do have in our society. And so I am so happy that the justice system as a whole currently is really making this a focus here in North Carolina to address these issues. They've always been with us. And I think it's sad that in our society, we need a name for something before we know what to do, right? We work in boxes, we work in labels. That's how our society works. We otherize people. We do it in the justice system. We do it in every governmental institution in this country. And so I'll close by saying that what we're really doing here isn't just educating on what this is, isn't just spreading statistics and giving out tools. That's an essential part. But in my perspective, what we're doing is we are looking at our minds. We are, there's a quote from Bell Hooks from her book, Killing Rage and Ending Racism from 1996, which was decades before anyone was talking about equity in our justice system. She says that in order to end racism, there must exist a paradigm, a practical model for social change that includes an understanding of ways to transform consciousness that are linked to efforts to transform structures. So we're changing the way that we think. We're doing that internally on an individual level. It starts with our own ways of thinking. And one reviewer of her book said that she talks about the terminology as decolonizing our minds. This is a strong word. That people think is a radical term, but that's what we're doing. We're revamping how we think about things and removing the ways that we've been taught. And so here we have a label, adverse childhood experiences, what we got from the experts a few decades ago that is talked about in this movie, like that we all of a sudden discovered this existed, but we always knew it existed. We just didn't know what we were seeing. So I put forth to you that how is this impacting our work? It's everywhere. It is our work. The children that are impacted, they grow up to adults. It's their parents. What we do to defendants in the criminal justice system affects their children and their families. And these are things that historically our justice system has failed to acknowledge. And so I'm really proud to be here today among all these other reputable panelists. And I think I'll bring today the real perspective of what it looks like inside a district court courtroom. We have hundreds of judges here across the state. Many of them I see are here, and I'm honored to be on the panel. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Judge Maris. Terry, both of you.
Okay, so my apologies, but I'm having connectivity issues, so I'm using both my cell phone and my computer. So I'm Terry Johnson, for the people who don't know me. I work with the Office of the Juvenile Defender as one of the assistant juvenile defenders, and I actually carry a caseload defending children in juvenile court systems in Iredell and Alexander County. I have practiced in that area since 2004. And in terms of how do adverse childhood experiences impact that work, I don't think I've had a client yet who has not been impacted by adverse childhood experiences, and multiple ones at that. That list that we saw earlier with the 10 questions that were on there, if I ask every single one of my clients those questions whenever they came in the door and base their scores off of those numbers, they would easily be 4 and higher for every single case that I see come in. And that's not just the child, that's the parents who are coming in with them and talking about their cases and what their circumstances were. One of the things that I noticed from the video was one of the doctors in speaking about those experiences, she talked about children who were misdiagnosed with ADHD and other types of diagnoses, when really it was, if we dug into a little bit more of their history and we knew a little bit more about their circumstances, we would find out it's really not ADHD. It's really not oppositional defiant. It's these children have been exposed to this level of stress for such a long period of time that their reaction in that school system is heightened. So when they get disciplined by a teacher or a school resource officer approaches them, their reaction is not what maybe my reaction would be or your reaction would be. It's a bit of an overreaction, and they end up charged and they end up in the juvenile system. Fortunately, we do have those intake processes with Department of Juvenile Justice. Some of those cases can be screened out. They can be diverted. So we do have a process in place where I think now those experiences are being screened on the front end. So some of those cases do get diverted, but for those where the parents don't meet with the school providers, they don't meet with DJJ, they don't meet with the appropriate authorities ahead of time, those are the kids that I see in court. And those children all have these specific issues, and they don't all have the same level of treatment. So in terms of how does it impact my work, it's their start to finish. From the day I receive the petition until the day that child either finishes their case because there's been a disposition and we're complete, or until they literally age out of the system.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Terry. When Judge Maris talked about decolonizing our minds, and then what you just shared about kids in school, it reminds me of a conversation I had with my daughter when she talked about kids in school who weren't paying attention. She was frustrated. She's a bit of a rule follower. And you know, sort of my initial reaction to her saying, oh, you know, what these kids did. And then, but I had to reframe my question, reframe the question I was asking about what was going on in that classroom and why it might be going on. So I really appreciate, you know, those two thoughts together. Chief Jennings, I want to come back to you. You were talking about some of what it means for law enforcement to implement, to change as a result of new learning and new understanding. Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to have trauma-informed practices from a law enforcement perspective, and how can we help it to become more the norm in the profession?
Yeah, I think the one thing that's important to realize and remember that law enforcement is just one facet of policing. And what we have to be able to look at is what enforcement action and how do we make it, any enforcement action end in a positive result. So one of the things I tell my staff and my officers is that if you're faced with a situation to where you're taking law enforcement action, what is your end game? What do you want to be able to accomplish at the end of that? Is it simply taking somebody to jail, or is it an opportunity to turn that person's life around, to get them on track, to keep them out of the system? And just as I mentioned earlier with our community engagement, you know, we are looking at different ways to do that through diversion programs with the juvenile diversion program in Charlotte, as well as we just kicked off the adult diversion program in Charlotte as well. So the way I feel that we need to be able to make those changes within the profession is, one, just the education on ACEs and ACEs scores and what that means. And you know, the film Resilience, it was just, I've seen it a couple of times, and you know, Dr. Anda that was on there, and you heard Ben say it earlier, is, you know, the question of not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. We changed that narrative, and what's happened to you is so much more powerful and so much more gearing towards how do we fix and how do we change rather than just what's wrong with you, just to identify the problems that someone may be having. So we have to be able to get that message out to law enforcement as a whole, and to let them know what this is and what it means. And then when you do that and you understand it, it gives you a whole new perspective of what you're doing with your job as far as on the law enforcement end. My big thing, and in closing, is just to make sure that, you know, as a profession, we want positive outcomes, not necessarily just to take care of and dish the problem or dish an issue off into the court system and be done with it.
Well said. I appreciate that point about the role of law enforcement is not just to enforce the law, but there are other functions that you ought to be thinking about. Terry, can we talk more about the school to prison pipeline? How can a better understanding help us stem it?
So it's the school justice partnership has already been mentioned a little bit earlier. And I think that's one thing that if people are not familiar with that, it's on some of the websites. A quick Google search will pull up a lot of information on the school justice partnership. And I think that's one step that has already been taken, because there's a partnership between all of these community actors that were mentioned before: faith-based leaders, school superintendents, school principals, school resource officers, and all of these other individuals come together and look at these cases individually and come up with plans for things that would keep juveniles out of court. But one statistic that I think people need to be aware of: pre-COVID, nearly 40% I think at last check, it was 42% of the delinquency cases that are filed in North Carolina came from schools. They were minor offenses. By and large, they're not felony offenses. There's a perception, I think, sometimes that these children are basically going crazy and they're committing all these horrible crimes. But the majority of them were things like disorderly conduct at school. So a child acts out and they get into a fight, or they curse at a teacher, or they have a bad day and they don't do well on the bus. Those are things that are being charged and brought into the school system that could certainly be handled better if school personnel, administrators, teachers, bus drivers understood ACEs better. If there were screenings that took place in the school, if you have a child who's consistently struggling and having problems and they're not doing well on their grades, but it doesn't appear to be lack of ability, they're falling asleep in class, or they seem to be a little bit touchy, and somebody is easily able to push that child's buttons to get them to react in a negative way, maybe there needs to be a screening process for those children with school counselors or social workers or other individuals to check for those factors. It's a relatively straightforward list of questions that could be asked to get a better picture of what's going on with these children. It doesn't necessarily need to be something so in-depth and intrusive, in the sense of family members might object and say, no, I don't want my child screened. But when you watch that video and you see these other places that have enacted those programs, it's working in these other states where they're screening these children and they're putting in place these programs in the school. If it's working there, we should be trying some of those programs here, because 42% of our children being charged from school-related offenses is a ridiculously high number. And with these studies and things in place, I mean, we can obviously use that in court whenever a child comes through and explain to a judge or a district attorney, here's what this child's circumstances were, and maybe get a better outcome on the back end. But we can certainly use those things on the front end. And I think the school justice partnership is a great way to do that. Maybe about 40 counties, I think is what I heard earlier, have the school justice partnerships already. I know there's a push to get those in place, but there's 100 counties in the state. We need those school justice partnerships in every single county at this point.
Indeed, and that was a recommendation of TRAC as well. So I appreciate that point. And one stakeholder that's not here that I feel like I should lift up their work, and that's the North Carolina Department of Public Safety's Juvenile Justice Division. They are doing intentional work with schools and with school resource officers to talk about their data in their schools. At the beginning of the year, Billy Lassiter's team is meeting with school resource officers about the complaints that were submitted, which ones were kicked back, which is a signal that they probably shouldn't have been sent in the first place. And so, we really need to make sure that we're not only training SROs, but school personnel on how to adequately deal with their issues in school and make sure that they aren't unnecessarily going to the justice system.
And I think that's a good point. The Department of Juvenile Justice does do a good job working with the schools and the school resource officers and screening these cases during intake. They don't approve every single case for court, but even the diversions are largely school-related offenses.
Indeed. Judge Maris, bringing in the perspective of judges to this conversation, what practices have judges implemented that can help us understand ACEs and help understanding the supporting children who are under stress?
Thanks, Jasmine. It's a great question. I'm not sure that I have the answer for all judges, and that therein lies the problem. And I think that's why the Administrative Office of the Courts recently held a special new statewide conference in May, which was the 2022 Family Court Educational Conference they called Back to the Basics, in which they did include presentations on ACEs. I could not attend, but I did see the agenda. And so I think they're trying to, I'm sure that the task force can speak, and I heard our panelists speak on the direction that AOC and the Chief Justice is trying to push these issues. But to answer your question, I think I can tell you again, I'm going to speak from reality here and not sugarcoat anything. And that's that, when I became a district court judge in 2017, there wasn't a bench card like that was given to us. And this bench card that was just released was actually given to the district court judges in our statewide conference. It was in our folder of materials. I got it last week at the conference. I have it right here. It's great. Got my blur on so you can't really see it. Put it right next to my face. In any case, there you go. In any case, I did on my own go and search for a bench card. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network makes one. Got this one for you. I can share the link on that one. So I haven't compared it yet to AOC's, but I did see some similar language. So the bench card is one thing that a judge can do. There's been a lot of bench cards released on various topics, trying to reframe our consciousness, make sure we don't have implicit bias when it comes to disproportionate outcomes related to race or socioeconomic status. I haven't seen a national bench card on how to treat LGBTQ parties, which I'd like to see come about. But, a piece of paper only goes so far as a willing mind, right? And so there's a combination of approaches to saying that we as judges and judicial actors, prosecutors, and other persons of power in the court system, we're committed to looking at this. And so you get the materials, you get the bench card, you read it, you go to the seminars like AOC has organized, like the school government has organized, you pay attention, and then you do your own research, you do your own reading. Because to me, it really is a big ask to tell some people who are not inherently empathetic people, you need to change how you interact with people, right? Because what we're taught to do is these bench cards tell us that. They're telling you, you got to think about how you're acting, right? They tell you, in case you don't know inherently how to be a listener and someone that's caring, that's what you need to do. You need to watch what you say, just like DA David was saying, looking at the conduct. We don't place blame on individuals in our language. Of course, there's some crimes where we do want to do that, but we need to think, we have to be very intentional. When you're a judge, when you're sitting up on the bench, every word that comes out of your mouth impacts somebody. And so we have to think about our tone, our language, our words, our body language. And frankly, as a judge, you have a responsibility for what everyone else in that courtroom is doing. And one of the things that's included in this bench card, I believe, and also the others, is that you have to think about, are your deputies in the courtroom, they say jingling handcuffs, are they acting in an intimidating manner? And so you are the conductor of the courtroom, and how you act sets an example for everybody else in that courtroom. You set the standard of professionalism, respect, and fair and compassionate treatment. So what are judges doing across the state? I can't say. I don't know what every judge is doing, but I can say as a moment of hope that I truly see a change system-wide here, that there has been evidence, a desire to see more judges being sensitive. And so once the system says this is important, then all of the actors have to pay attention. And that's exactly what this task force is doing. It's exactly what AOC is doing. And I'm proud of that. I'm really proud of that. But we've got to tell, when we have these seminars, these sessions, we need the people that are up at the top of the court system to say this isn't discretionary. You know, we gave you this bench card, and how about let's send an email out to everybody, all the judges, after we send it out from the top of the food chain. We sent this out because this matters. So please read it. And here's a slew of other resources you can take to independently educate yourself. And then when you're in the courtroom and you're not a judge, but you're somebody else that sees a judge acting in a way that you think is harming someone, don't be intimidated. I tell people all the time, if I'm doing something, I told people when I was getting appointed, when I've run for office, come tell me that I've done something wrong. And every once in a while, a brave attorney will say to me, Judge, when you said such and such, I thought this. And I appreciate that. So there's my long-winded answer, but there's no one answer.
Thank you for that, Judge Maris. I appreciate it. And perhaps you've given some folks the opportunity to be brave and say something to a judge, although the lawyer in me says, I don't know if I'd say anything either, but I appreciate the point. Mary, so we've heard a lot about the impact of ACEs on children. And you alluded to this, earlier in your earlier remarks. There are obviously many adults in the justice system who used to be children who had those impacts. How can we use our learning here to impact the justice system more broadly? Because it seems like we're finally getting to a point of recognition where people understand children are different and we need to handle children differently. And we have Raise the Age and we have school justice partnerships, not everywhere, but people are coming along. What about the adults?
So yes, a couple of different ways. First, there was a moment in the movie that struck me, and it was when the young mother was sweeping up and trying to recover from the aftermath of a domestic violence assault and figuring out where to go. And the woman I wish I had written down her name, who came to work through it with her and sit with her and listen to her, said, there's always a reason why we do what we do. And she was saying that in context of a different context, sort of like, but it's true. There's always a reason we do what we do. And how does this affect the adult offenders who used to be children? Two things, right? Our criminal justice system, we have two main goals, right? Retribution and rehabilitation. So I'll take them one at a time. Retribution, how do we assess the punishment for somebody who has transgressed against the community, right? And it's not just a matter of whether somebody is convicted, whether they're guilty or innocent, right? It's also about assessing relative degrees of moral culpability. Is a person whose mind and body were destroyed as a child through no fault of their own, through a situation they had no control over, are they as morally culpable as a similarly situated offender who didn't have those experiences, right? So when we're assessing punishment, we should take this into account. This is explicitly recognized in capital cases, right? If someone is convicted of first-degree murder in a case that's being pursued capitally, the question of punishment goes to the jury, to citizens, and generally speaking, the defense counsel will present evidence of childhood trauma because it's virtually always there. And jurors listen and they're receptive. And when they're assessing moral culpability, they in recent years almost overwhelmingly spare the convicted person from the death sentence and sentence them to life without parole. Those are jurors and members of the community. Now, of course, the vast majority of people who are go through the criminal justice system in our state are not charged capitally and are not being tried and convicted for first-degree murder. But there's still a whole lot of discretion in how we assess punishment for these offenses, right? I mean, it starts with the DA's charging decision and the sentence sought by the DA. Judges, we have structured sentencing, but there's still a lot of wiggle room in there about how you run the sentences. Are you going to run them concurrently or consecutively? And I think it's incumbent on all of us to learn and consider and be aware of and be educated about these childhood events and childhood traumas so that we can appropriately assess relative moral culpability. And maybe we don't need to send people who are not a threat to public safety away for decades and decades sometimes. And then, you know, on another level, I was encouraged, you know, therapeutic justice. I like that term, right? Therapeutic justice, alternative sentencing. I think we need to be exploring all of that for these folks. Of course, the other half of it is then what's the other thing we try to do? Rehabilitation. So there are a whole lot of adults and they've been tried and convicted and they're incarcerated in our state prisons. And I think that the vast majority of them, again, it's not like capital cases or life without parole. The vast majority of these folks are going to be released into the community and we want them to succeed. We want them to be successful. We want the community to be safe. We don't want them to be coming back to prison. So how do we use what we've learned about traumatic childhood experiences and how to treat adults for this PTSD or the effects of what happened as children? I'm not being very articulate here, but we have to resource our Department of Corrections or our Department of Prisons so that they can develop and work with the incarcerated folks to get them the help they need so they will succeed when they get out. I'm aware of some for example, there's I think a pretty successful domestic violence offender treatment program that's been piloted in some of the units, but DPS is under-resourced, right? They need money, they need support, they need expertise to help redress these issues for incarcerated people. And I guess that's that. I also, just parenthetically, when I was at Prisoner Legal Services, we dealt with so many prisoner medical issues, and DPS really struggles with that inmate medical budget. And I guess until I saw this movie, people will say, oh, it's, you know, prison isn't healthy or it was lifestyle choices. No, right? I mean, no, these folks, their health conditions may well date back to the childhood trauma. So I know it's not popular, but we've got to find the funds to humanely treat our folks in prison. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you for that, Mary. I really appreciate the framing of the two sides of what we're trying to do with our criminal justice system and how there's something there for both sides in terms of the learning and the way that we can do it better. So I have one more question for the panel for now, then we're going to pause and get to some of the questions in the Q&A. There's a growing emphasis on mental health. You know, it's the woke generation, and they're woke about mental health too, right? Especially young people. But there's still a stigma and a reticence to discuss it. So how can we help parents, other caregivers, society as a large be more willing to engage in this conversation? And that's to everybody. So yeah, DA David, you want to take it first?
I'll jump in by saying we need to model the behavior we would hope of our communities. And what I mean by that is there's a stigma associated with reaching out for help as a leader. And someone in law enforcement, for instance, who rolls up on a critical incident. We had a triple homicide in my district recently. I'm so proud of our chief, Donnie Williams at WPD, who said, everyone who saw that scene, mandatory counseling. I'm so proud of when we have a critical incident like an officer use of force, where these officers, after the investigation, need to debrief with counselors because that's a hard thing for them to have to do. Sometimes to even take a life in those cases. And so we have to recognize that more officers kill themselves each year than are killed in the line of duty. And very frequently, when you roll back the clock, what you find is that there is great stress with these jobs. The toxic stress that we talk about in resilience is not confined to children, but to the people working with the children and the adults in these criminal justice environments. And there is stigma associated with saying it's okay not to be okay. And so I love leaders like Chief Johnny Jennings on the task force who have put support networks in place within his agency to say, we are going to make sure that we are taking care of the people who are serving and protecting. DAs frequently run the largest law firms in their community. Mine in particular here in New Hanover and Pender County is the largest legal employer. I mandate that people take vacations. I give my employees 2 hours off each week to go volunteer in the community. I want them to have a balanced life outside of this office. And I talk to them when I think that there's anything wrong. Because the number one reason we have use of force cases or unethical conduct in the criminal justice system, it's usually folks who are burned out and at the end of their rope. And so loving on our people and making sure that they're healthy makes us all safer and healthier in the criminal justice system. And it's right by the individuals who are putting themselves on the line every day to do these jobs. And so for the communities we serve, we should simply model that behavior. And that is the number one recommendation that we have come up with from the resiliency task forces for both New Hanover and Pender County that have all sorts of subcommittees, including a criminal justice task force. The number one thing we said is, let's take care of each other before we try and take care of the communities we serve when it comes to being more resilient.
Any of the other panelists want to weigh in on this question?
So I would say for the parents, when you're trying to destigmatize for them, it's not just destigmatizing, it's taking away their fear of what if I ask for help? Because that parent who has a substance abuse problem, or that parent who's suffering from domestic violence or a mental health issue that's left untreated, they're afraid that if they ask for help, their children are going to be taken away from them. They're afraid that a report's going to be made to Department of Social Services and they're going to be investigated, and their cry for help is going to turn into a punishment. Some of that's lack of understanding, and some of it's past experience where these things have happened to them, what they remember as a child being removed from their parents' home, or as an adult losing another child to DSS custody because they made that request for help. It's teaching them. There are things that you can ask for. There are resources that you can go to, that you're not going to lose your children. We're going to help you, and we're going to put resources in place. But sometimes when they don't understand that, that fear is what's stopping them from asking for help. It's not just that they're worried about what's somebody going to think of me, what's that person's perception going to be. They're worried about the practical, real world applications to their life. Am I going to lose my house? Am I going to lose my children? Am I going to have this adult that I take care of removed from my home because I'm struggling to take care of myself? It's all of that combined. So we need resources to help, not just to help them understand and to help them know that it's okay to ask for help, but to know that when they ask for that help, it's not going to turn into a punishment for them.
Well said. Chief Jennings?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I also have to commend, all the way around how far we've come in the recent history on when it comes to mental health and the stigma that we discuss all the time. But we still have a very long way to go. But I do remember it was taboo to even talk about it within law enforcement profession. You were seen as weak or unable to do the job. And we have made a great deal of strides in taking away that stigma of saying that I need help, I need to be able to take care of myself so I can take care of the community. And a lot of it's putting your money where your mouth is. And, I made a specific issue that we hired a clinical psychologist for our department that's full-time within our department. And we have kept her very busy since over the last, 8 or so months that she's been here. And it's been such a blessing to our officers to be able to have that resource. And we're not stopping there. There's more things that we can do and provide her a staff that we can even do more outreach. But think about how much money we spend on arresting, prosecuting, and incarcerating just our young people. And think about if that money was diverted, we have to be able to put more money on the front end when it comes to mental health services, so that we can save the money on the back end when we start talking about how much does it cost to actually incarcerate an individual. So, commend everyone for in how far we've come, but we still have a long way to go.
Well said. Thank you, Chief. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A, and I will apologize in advance. I may summarize your question, but the full text is there in the Q&A if folks want to take a look. So the first question is about the foster care system. How can we expedite that process so kids are not in DSS custody for 3 years waiting because of a court backlog? I don't know if any of our panelists have anything to say about that question.
I'll just say that if you look to the state of Florida, the same great state that back in the mid-90s gave us the drug treatment model that we've embraced fully here in my district under the leadership of Judge James Faison, they have something called safe baby courts that really look at that 0 to 5 population that I mentioned in the slide deck. There are best practices already out there. There's an organization called 0 to 3 that's trying to pilot these same types of courts in 12 different states, spending over $20 million from the federal government, understanding fully that a lot of the best research in this country is taking place at Duke University. The Bolsh Institute, who's working with us on training judges right now and helping us turn out this bench card, they've been doing this work for years. And so what I would say is we don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to reducing the time for foster placements or reunifying those children with their families, these babies with their families. Those safe baby courts have cut that time in half, and that has to be the goal. Justice delayed is justice denied. We all have heard of that. And there's no question that our courts are backlogged right now because of the pandemic. These children have lost the protective factor of school. Many of them have not had the fair hearing that they need in a courtroom. So it's an urgent call right now in our courts that we need to prioritize the cases involving our youngest clients that might not be in DA's caseloads right now, but they're absolutely the ones that if we put our loving arms around right now, we can change the trajectory of their lives and make them healthier and safer. So I would say in response to that question, look to what Florida's doing and watch very closely what our task force tries to do over this next year to see if we can pilot some of those great initiatives in multiple districts throughout this state.
Thank you, DA David. Anyone else want to add anything to that answer? Judge Maris, I'm looking at you.
Well, I think what the question is speaking to, and incidentally, as an aside, I answered several of the questions myself in the answer section, but I don't want the fact that I answered them to take them away from the panel's discussion. I thought that we were supposed to answer them ourselves, so I already started answering them. But in any case,
overachiever, it's all good.
I wasn't sure, but I think what the person is asking here, and I don't have her name in front of me, is that why is it taking so long for this case to get heard in court? And I mean, the bottom line is, I can only speak from what I know, but our A&D courts, which stands for abuse, neglect, dependency, are some of the hardest courts for anyone that works in there, not just because of the subject matter, which it can be very difficult, and the impact on the children, the families, the parents, and everyone, but the workload. There are so many cases. And, I know that here in Durham, our 2 judges we have that are assigned to this court that meets 2 out of 4 weeks or every other week, we only have 1 guardian ad litem attorney. And without an additional attorney, we couldn't have any more court weeks because we don't have her to put in another courtroom. Also, it's a staffing issue. I know that Durham and in my jurisdiction, it has been said from AOC that we actually don't need another judge or need less than a judge. And again, I'm just going to speak truth to the facts here. But the truth of the matter is that we need more staff. And I'm sure that's the case in other jurisdictions, that there's a lot of focus when people are looking at our court system in the public. There's a lot of criticism of what's going on in our criminal justice system and our criminal courts, but not enough people are paying attention to what's going on in our civil courts, which is what A&D is, and also family court, where I'm one of our family court judges. We also have a backlog. So COVID increased it, and We need more judges, we need more staff, we need more court time. And that's something that the court system can give us. That's something the legislature can give us. They can say they'll pay for additional guardian ad litem attorneys and things of that nature. So I'm going to look up, DA David, whatever they're doing in Florida with the safe baby courts and see if that could help. But to the person's question, I understand why you're asking. It's a major problem that families have to wait. And it's happening in our civil courts everywhere. And I can tell you that in Durham, my colleagues are working as hard as they possibly can. We're doing the best that we can to hear cases, but we need more staff and we need more court time in those courtrooms. We don't need as much time in our criminal courts. The dockets have decreased over the past few years. So I'll say that the court system needs to look at giving more resources to these civil courts to give these families resolution.
Thank you, Judge Maris. The next question is making the point that just showing truth and the harm is not enough. We also need to bring along others who may be not as on board, shall we say, as those who are on this call. And so how do we do that? How do we bring along stakeholders who aren't buying what we're selling here today?
So for me, bringing along the stakeholders who are not really buying into this, it's more training. It's getting the word out to them with these types of videos and programs so that they see the practical impact. The resilience video it's a great video. I hope that all of our judges at some point have watched it or will be watching it. And I'd like for all of our prosecutors and other stakeholders to see that video as well, because it puts into perspective things that when you're arguing it in the courtroom, I'm arguing it from a defense standpoint. Clearly, I want the best outcome for my client. But here's this group of researchers who went to the trouble to do all of this work and prove all the things that we've been arguing, that these childhood effects carry out through this person's entire life. And if we can stop those early or put in place those positive persons and resources for them, then maybe we don't need this person to be on probation for 12 months or in detention for 2 weeks or in YDC until their 21st birthday. Those training programs, we have all kinds of opportunities for that with webinars that can be done now, in-person trainings. To me, I think that's the number one thing that we should be doing, is personalizing the trainings to those different stakeholders and making them understand how it's not just beneficial to this specific child or this specific family, but how it is going to impact everything that they're doing overall. And then maybe when they see the positive outcomes in a bigger picture type way, they'll be more invested and at least maybe at least more willing to try some of the things that are being proposed.
Thank you, Terry. Dear David, I want to pick on you to ask you to answer that question. I think you might have colleagues who don't see this quite the same way that you do.
Well, actually, I have been very heartened by the response of other district attorneys, not just in North Carolina, but as I've gone to other states even to talk about the work we're doing. And let me say this, nothing will swing people around in these jobs better than pointing to the scoreboard and showing results. We're reducing crime by these efforts, and all statistics in my district are showing that. And I'll tell you what we need to be unapologetic about. That is, we're so dichotomous right now in our society that it seems like people are so divided. It's either you want criminal justice reform or you love and support the member of the police. I love Michael Jordan, who's from Wilmington, by the way. Right after the Black Lives Matter movement started in Ferguson, right after those officers were killed in Dallas, Michael Jordan, who, as we all know, has a lot of money, put his money where his mouth is. He put up $2 million. He gave $1 million to the NAACP because he said, as a Black man in America, I believe the justice system must be better. And he was right about that. But he also gave $1 million to the Policemen's Benevolent Association because, as the son of a murder victim, he loves and supports the men and women of law enforcement and those of us who do this job. So in other words, what he said is, it's not either or, it's yes and. We can really do both. And I think those of us who hopefully have garnered reputations as being tough on crime and unapologetic about it. And I could take Mary Pollard to task on some of the things she said respectfully about using ACEs scores with serial killers and capital murder cases. That's not a theoretical conversation. That's the James Bradley case that I was in. The only death penalty I've tried in 15 years as the elected DA. And I brought up the fact that his 5 victims he was grooming and the 3 he had killed all had higher ACE scores than Mr. Bradley. So I object to the science being used in that way. But I absolutely agree that it should be used as a diagnostic tool for our children and get them the resources they need now. So what I think we need to do in the criminal justice system is not be afraid to disagree with each other, and also to help speak the truth, because that's what verdict means, and to not label the other side when they disagree with us, but to say, we all want the same thing when it comes to fairness, efficiency, doing right by our kids, ending implicit bias and structural inequality. Those of us who are passionate about these jobs need to get on the same page in the interest, especially of our children, to get this done, even if we're going to disagree with each other sometimes. And those of us who have these jobs, when that room closes and it's our colleagues, we should be unafraid to speak the truth.
If I may, I think my point was, and I'm not familiar with the specific case you're talking about, but I'm assuming in that case, the evidence was presented to the fact finders and they made their decision of death. In many other cases where the evidence is presented to the fact finders, they make the decision of life. And that's my point. That's my point. It should be considered whether the fact finder is a juror or a judge in assessing punishment and moral culpability. So that's the point I was trying to make.
Thanks, Mary. The next question is, when someone is diverted in the system, as Chief Jennings said, what happens? Are they given adequate treatment to develop resiliency? Who is responsible for the diverted individuals? And obviously the answer to that matters. Oh, it looks like Judge Maris, you were typing an answer to that. But it matters what kind of diversion you're talking about, obviously at what stage in the criminal justice system. But does anybody want to talk about the role of diversion here broadly?
So for juvenile court purposes, if a child is charged and diverted, there's an initial screening. There's an intake process where the family is mailed a letter. They may be contacted by phone by Department of Juvenile Justice, juvenile court counselors, and that intake counselor will schedule a meeting with the family and the child. They meet and the court counsel will make a decision about whether or not to divert the case. Certain cases are non-divertible. So, B1 sex offenses are going to be a non-divertible. Certain types of drug offenses are non-divertible. Murder is a non-divertible offense. But for those that are divertible, they ask a series of questions and do evaluations. And during this intake process, they talk to the parents or the guardian, they talk to the child, and they gather information about who's living in your home, what's the background of those family members, are you exposed to criminal backgrounds? So if you've got a family member who is in prison, those questions are being asked at intake. And based on those answers, if the case does get diverted, it's 6 months. And the child and the family are supervised by Department of Juvenile Justice, and they may be asked to do things like have a mental health assessment, comply with some recommended treatment. They may be asked to do some community service. There's a number of things. They could be sent to teen court. So they could be sent to a number of programs that would assist them during that 6-month time period. If they are not successful, then that case might be closed. But more likely than not, it will be approved for court and the kid will be sent and the family will be sent into juvenile delinquency court, where the petition can then be heard and a more full hearing happens on those particular cases. But in terms of, do they get everything they need in that 6-month diversion? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on how invested the child is, how invested the family members are, what the services are in that particular county. Some counties have more services than other counties do. You've already heard the urban-rural split. There's obviously more services available in the more urban populations than there are in others. So the short answer is sometimes yes, they get everything they needed in 6 months, and sometimes they don't.
Thank you, Terry. Chief Jennings, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in because somebody mentioned it. It is correct. It depends on what type of diversion you're talking with, and talking about the diversion that I'm speaking of within our police department specifically is to keep the individual out of the criminal justice system to begin with. So there are certain offenses that officers have that option to say, I can take this person to jail and put them in the criminal justice system, and then maybe even look at diversion after that. Or I can avoid that trip to jail altogether and have that person agree to go through a diversion program that we hold here at the police department specifically. And those diversion programs are to get that person back on track, whether it's the adult diversion or juvenile diversion. But we have a series of programs and training and things that we put them through over the course of a long period of time, that if they successfully complete it, then we don't even pursue any type of prosecution on the charges that we might have that individual on. So the goal is to not just say, complete this, you check a box and you're done, but it's to get that person in the mindset of being a better individual and a better person within our society, and then also help them after that for jobs. So part of that diversion is job training and things. And we have a group of great partners within our city that will provide jobs for individuals who are successful in completing the program.
Thank you, Chief. I think we have time for one more in the Q&A, and I'll send these out to the panelists, and if they have anything they want to add, we could send this to the folks that are registered for the event. Does the task force, and I think they mean the Chief Justice's task force, offer any training in local communities to bring together local task forces so they can work with stakeholders to address ACEs? DA David, you might be best placed to answer that.
Well, I want to commend the AOC, first of all, because they train stakeholders throughout the criminal justice system. And there are many modules that we're putting together. For instance, the wonderful school justice partnership that is in 40 communities that started right here under the leadership of our Chief Judge Jay Corpening is going to hopefully go statewide. We have a video that we just filmed that's going to give people a little bit more information that you're going to be able to find on that website. We are working to make our communities more resilient by having these stakeholder groups outside of the court system working with us. And there's some wonderful work going on with that. Our advisory task force with the Chief Justice has, again, subject matter experts that are outside the criminal justice system, advising us on the best way to partner with the communities we serve. And we really believe that one of the first steps as we move into year 2 of this task force is to, again, take a resource assessment rooted in the local level, particularly looking at our underserved rural communities. We all know that we need more than 3% of the overall state budget for this co-equal branch called the court system. We know that we need to bloom where we're planted, so to speak, and work with what we have on the ground. And so this effort is going to take all of us, including people that are outside the criminal justice system. Our year 2 efforts are really going to focus now that we've become more trauma informed internally, how do we partner with the people who have been doing this for years, and they have, and have the expertise to really work on this therapeutic justice we're talking about, particularly as it relates to our kids. And that's where we're moving in year 2 of this effort, is now that we're trauma informed, now that all of us have watched this film, we have the bench cards, and we have this plan to really get more of these best practices, sometimes from other places, implemented in our courts. How can we best work with the communities who are already doing this and who are screaming out for these resources to get directly to them? So we look forward to that conversation. And the best way, I think, to stay engaged is through the online efforts that we've set up through our website. And these are public meetings, and we welcome the participation of other people as we go around the state to hold them. We've gone to Charlotte, we're going to be in Asheville, we've been in Wilmington and Raleigh. And as we go to different places, we are hearing about best practices from those communities so that we can look to see what might best be scaled for the 100 counties of this great state.
Thanks, DA David. I want to wrap with a question to all of you because I know I need a moment of hope in these times. What gives you hope that we can help people impacted by ACEs? Start with you, Mary. Sorry to pick on you first.
What gives me hope is, I guess, that we're recognizing and talking about these issues in a way that I don't think we have been historically. So, yeah.
Thank you. Terry?
So I agree with Mary and the fact that we're talking about this and having these panel discussions, that this video is being distributed to people. That's one thing, but also just, again, the information that's provided in the video when you're listening to these doctors and these researchers and all of these individuals talk about, yes, these adverse childhood experiences have all of these terrible impacts, but we have services that we can put in place and things that we can do that can minimize those impacts, that can put these children and these families back in a much better position so that we don't have the increased effects of those experiences. One of the individuals in the video made some comment to the effect of, yes, our body remembers these experiences, but this doesn't have to define who you are, and these experiences are not something that guarantees that you're going to have a negative outcome, because if we can put in place all of these services and help these family members, we can get them back into a better position so their life expectancy is not shortened by 20 years, and some of these health effects don't have to be as bad as they are. The programs that they talked about in those videos, that gives me hope. They're showing that these programs work. They've had success in all these other states with these programs, and if we can just expand those to other areas, I think that's a very positive thing.
Thanks, Terry. Chief Jennings?
Well, Jasmine, this is one question I wish you'd ask me first because my answer is about identical. So that was the first thing that popped up in my mind when you asked that was, the fact that we're talking about it and that we're recognizing it more because, early on in my career in law enforcement, this was unheard of. I would have never, you never looked at, what happened to somebody to bring them to a point of where they are and how did they get to that interaction that you're having from a law enforcement perspective. So now that we're looking and talking about it, we're giving more alternatives in different ways of handling situations. So that's what gives me hope. And I think it continues to be stronger and get better.
Thank you. Judge Maris?
Or I don't want to be redundant. I think the biggest piece of hope that we have here is that people are paying attention, right? It's, as I said at the very beginning, when the system is paying attention and you have the top of the food chain caring about these issues, which we already have, that means change is coming. That's what that means. And so change is coming. Change has been coming. It's been in the works in various parts of the state, but uniform change across the state is coming. That's what our court system here in North Carolina is saying. That's what the panelists are saying today. And that's what I believe. And it is important that we understand that local communities don't all have the same needs as other communities. And so making sure that when we have court actors involved in these commissions and task force and projects, that we have in the forefront the impacted individuals. We have the people that have experienced ACEs themselves. We have criminal justice involved individuals who have been through the system so they can tell us what it's been like being a part of this. That's really important. So I want to just lift up that piece. But I'm encouraged because the system is paying attention. And I would like to encourage everyone here that's passionate about these issues to participate, to get involved and get your place at the table. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Judge Maris. Thank you. Dear David, you get the last word on this.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. What gives me hope is something called PACEs. The idea that there's positive, just as there's adverse childhood experiences, and the love of just one caring adult can truly make the difference between a kid going to prison or to college. And we need to understand that there's ways to make everybody more resilient. That includes those of us in the criminal justice and so many people outside of it too. And I am buoyed by the fact that wherever I've gone and talked about this, so many people have come up to me of every possible background, Republican, Democrat, white, black, metro, rural, all saying the same thing, which is this is just the right thing to be doing, to use science to actually prevent cases and not just solve them and prove them, to not be reactive but proactive, and to understand that there are people listening right now who are great leaders in our state. And some of you have been writing to me while I've been listening to you that they have high ACE scores, and yet here they are as judges. They're running big organizations, they're police officers, and the way they succeeded is the same way that we're going to get our kids to succeed. They've had adversity, but it's built their character, and they understand that they were the lucky ones because they had a correspondingly high resilience score as well. And so what's going to allow our children to succeed is to get them with their families who are going to raise them, not the government. We're going to return their fathers to their homes by holding expungement clinics as prosecutors. We're going to work on not incarcerating and treating where we can. And we're going to understand that the way to succeed for these children are the same things that all of us have succeeded by. And that's tough love. And this is about being tough on violent crime. But for our kids in particular, we need to show them the love. We need to get the resources to them right now. And that's what this task force is all about, and why I'm so excited to help co-chair it with my good friend Andrew Heath. And I thank the Chief Justice and the Attorney General for giving us this opportunity to talk to so many other people in our state today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just as a reminder, you can email criminaljustice@ncdoj.gov to get access to the film through the end of the day today if you haven't had a chance to watch it yet. TREC and the Chief Justice's Task Force on ACEs Informed Courts are really excited to be able to share this with you today. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. Everybody have a great afternoon.